Okay, good morning, everybody. I apologize for not making the pre-Purim discussion on the 10 sons of Haman. We'll have to wait until next year. Got some good stuff on that. Before we get close to Pesach, we talk about some of the issues regarding Pesach. I want to bring up another issue, which is very, very important, and it has become more important in recent years, the issue of privacy and confidentiality. We understand that this exists in certain specific occupations. If you are a rabbi or a minister, if you are a psychologist, if you are a physician, if you are an attorney, if you are a teacher, there are things that come up that are of a confidential nature. And to what extent does the halacha bind you to keep those confidences, to keep what is told to you privacy private? Is there an understanding of confidentiality among friends? Where do you draw the line between repeating what somebody told you versus rechilus, lashon hara? These are interesting questions. And there are a number of different categories that we'll talk about. There's professional confidentiality, which we understand, confidentiality among friends, which we have to explore a little bit. And also there is a situation where there is no explicit understanding or even intention of confidentiality. Very often, friends talk among themselves, even as a group, as opposed to one friend to another friend. To what extent are you expected to keep those confidences confidential? Well, since you're talking about it in a group, can you share it with other people? Especially when it causes other people harm. And how do you define harm? Is it harm in terms of reputation? Is it financial harm? Psychological? There's all kinds of different types of harm that we can get into. So they're trying to categorize it. There are three categories, I think, where there is a legal obligation to protect whatever somebody told you in confidence. Then there is a presumption of confidence, either because the speaker may have said so specifically or the nature of the conversation, though it may not be legal, but it's implied. And then there is a situation where there's no presumption of confidentiality. And that also requires some investigation as to what that really means. If I tell you something about somebody else, how do you determine how private to keep that conversation? I say something either bad about somebody or even something good about somebody. What possible harm can there be if I share good news about somebody else? So-and-so just became a grandfather. Mazel tov. If I tell that to somebody else, am I violating a confidentiality? Now, under most circumstances, not. But what if this person doesn't have any grandchildren? That's right, you can cause jealousy. Or if the person has a child who has tried and not been able to have a successful pregnancy over a period of time, that could be a hurtful thing to say. So sometimes, even though you think nominally, Mazel Tov is always a good thing to have, for some people, it might be hard to hear. So these are something to have to keep in mind. The Mishnah says that you can't, a judge, for example, and that's professional confidentiality issues, a judge may not disclose which judges voted in the majority and which judges voted in the minority. And it's based on an interesting pasuk in Mishlei. And a lot of the stories about confidentiality come back to this pasuk. It talks about Mishlei Perek Yud Aleph pasuk Yud Gimel. Holech Rachil. A person goes who tells tales about somebody else. Megale Sod reveals confidences. V'nemon Ruach Mechase Davar. A person who is trustworthy is someone who is Mechase Davar, who doesn't share private conversations. If somebody wanted someone else to know, he would tell that person. If that person told you, that's for you. But again, sometimes you have to judge what is consistent with tale-bearing or repeating something, and what isn't. The Gemara says, and this is a fascinating source, that when you are told something in general, you are not to repeat it. Very simple, because if that person wanted to tell other people, you take an ad in the paper, you denounce it. And it's based on a fascinating puzzle.
Wally,
Yes.
what if it's good news? Did you hear so-and-so just had a baby, someone just got engaged, someone just got married?
It depends who you're telling it to. If you're telling it to somebody who's got a child who's 33 years old,
Right.
isn't married yet, that may not be such good news.
Okay. But generally,
Yeah,
if you're aware of the situation and you're not
100%, 100%. The Mishnah in Yuma, based on a pasuk, it says, "Meinayin laomer dover shlachavero shehu b'val yomar ad sheyomar lo." How do you know that you shouldn't repeat something that somebody tells you unless he specifically tells you you're allowed to repeat it? Where's that come from? Shenemar vayedaber Hashem elov me'ohel moed lemor. Hashem spoke to Moshe, telling him to repeat what he said. So since he told him to go out and tell people, that you may do. Otherwise, one should keep to himself what he's told. Yes.
So does that mean that obviously on the shul handout that someone, all those mazel tovs, and then they're repeated when the announcement that the Baalei Simcha, whether it's grandparents or grandchild, whatever, the Baalei Simcha, called the shul office and said to put it in the handout, so then it's the heter because they said it's okay. But meanwhile, you've got all these congregants sitting
right
here.
Okay, so you're raising a very, very important point, one that I cannot rule on, obviously, but if it's done in a communal setting where you're not specifically singling out an individual that it might affect, then there might be grounds to allow it. To share the good news communally, as opposed to sharing it with an individual who might be offended or hurt. So that's a very good question. Yeah.
You just said before about Moshe and Hashem about permission to repeat. Most people, once again, most people think if they don't hear the words, do not repeat it. When they hear something, they think that it can be repeated.
So
That's how most people think.
So one of the takeaways from this morning's discussion might be that isn't always the case. Now, when somebody tells you something, he's telling you, and unless he says it's okay to tell other people.
It's supposed to be the whole opposite. Say, yeah, don't repeat this, and they can repeat it.
Yeah, but a person doesn't always have to say don't repeat it for you not to repeat it, apparently. That would be, I think, the intention of the halacha, because again, from a halachic perspective, these type of conversations are not highly regarded. People shouldn't spend their time talking about other people, good, bad, or otherwise. It's a waste of time, and it sometimes have negative effects. And you can cause damage to people who want a certain secrets to remain secret. There's also an issue of tznius, in some case, to tell people about certain private matters. If I tell my best friend about a certain surgical procedure I may have had, it doesn't mean he can go and blab it to everybody else on the block. He's a good friend, so I can share it with him. He knows what I've been through. He knows what someone else. But again, if you tell somebody something in confidence, or even if you don't specifically say, I'm telling you, and please don't share this with anybody else, you have to, common sense is the fifth chelek of Shulchan Aruch. And it's a huge volume. You have to keep that in mind. And again, tznius, private issues, rechilus is another issue. There are technical categories that the Bali Musa talk about in terms of different levels of lashon hara, rechilus, things of that sort. And Rabbi Yonah goes into it in great detail. Again, if somebody specifically says don't repeat it, that's very, very clear. If you discovered information on your own, assuming there's no lashon hara involved, is there a prohibition to repeat something? In all probability, yes. And again, the question of tznius, things that remain private for a variety of different reasons, especially when you're dealing with issues of male-female relationships, a woman who might be divorced, who might be looking to get remarried, it's nobody's business. You saw her on a date with somebody. You happened to be in the theater and you saw her with another guy. So should you go home and tell your next door neighbor, or either your wife or your husband? It's inappropriate. What a person does in their own privacy is, it's interesting. Somebody told me something, which I haven't repeated to anybody. But he and his wife went on a vacation, and they wanted to go someplace where nobody else would be. And they found this far-off place, wherever it was, which country it was, is irrelevant. And they were at this place. Not that they wouldn't never meet a frum Jew, but a Jew at all. I mean, it was a very, very far location. And who do they see on the beach? They see a well-known individual who also probably went there to be anonymous. And she was not dressed in the most tznius fashion on the beach. And this was a very, very well-known personality. He didn't go over and say hello to her, obviously. He mentioned it to me. I was shocked. And I haven't repeated the story, and I won't repeat the story. But the fact is, people discover information unintentionally. And it probably would have been better had he not shared that with me. Because now my image of that person is totally changed. And it's just, people are human beings. Human beings, by definition, are weak, they're fallible, but we don't have to necessarily publicize people's fallibilities. There's a lot of issues about revealing secrets. One of the early postscripts, yes.
Is the person receiving the information just as Shiur as the person giving it? For example, in your case, you weren't aware. He blurted it out before you had a chance to say, don't tell me anything.
Right.
But if you know he's going to say lashon hara and you're receiving it, you're just as Shiur as he is.
You're right. If you know someone's going to tell you lashon hara about somebody or a chilus, you should say, I don't want to hear. I don't want to hear. My brother-in-law, Oliver Shalom, was like that. The minute somebody would start a conversation, I don't want to hear it. Don't tell me. I don't want to know. And he was right. End of discussion. Rabbeinu Gershom, 10th century, the progenitor of Ashkenazic postscript, issued some very, very famous communal ordinances. Throughout the Middle Ages, Jewish communities would have conferences of the Gedolei Hador several times a year, and they would issue certain haramim, certain ordinances that punishable by cherem that the community had to observe, covering a whole range of topics. Professor Louis Finkelstein wrote a whole book gathering all of these communal ordinances, all the Rishonim. So Rabbeinu Gershom was known, the famous one, the Chaim Rabbeinu Gershom, about having more than one wife. Ashkenazi Jews shouldn't have more than one wife. And that's been the standard, based on Rabbeinu Gershom. In that same Chaim, which perhaps is not as well known, he says, also, don't read somebody else's mail. issue of privacy, confidentiality. Okay, how was mail delivered in those days? You paid a guy to ride on horseback, and he'd go from town to town or on a ship to deliver mail. And these people were very, very popular because they knew the goings on of the community. They knew business transactions, they knew romance, they knew everything. And they had to be very, very trustworthy people because you didn't have, envelopes where you have them now and they're sealed. You wrote on a piece of paper, sometimes it was sealed, sometimes it wasn't sealed, you could wrap it up in a piece of string. And it would take months until you get a response sometimes. But he was the first one to deal with it in a halakhic way, say it is prohibited to read somebody else's mail because it's a violation of privacy, which was considered a very, very important halakhic concept. And everybody falls in line following that. Interesting that, and it's fascinating how the halakhic process works. 500 years later, they were still discussing this chayrim, and they asked, does the chayrim apply even if it wasn't written on the outside of the envelope, pay gimel yud nun? What's pay gimel yud yud? Horetz geder yishchenu nachash. Anybody who violates the chayrim against reading someone else's mail should be punished. So even if you don't write down on the outside of the envelope, personal and confidential, then you still violate the chayrim by opening and reading the letter. So obviously the answer is yes. And they were discussing this for 500-600 years later. Interesting, one of the Achronim says that reading someone else's mail is a violation of v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Brilliant insight. By reading someone else's mail, violating his privacy, you're violating the deraisa of v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. There are legal questions that are raised in terms of if witnesses took an oath not to reveal certain information, and now they're called to testify, are they allowed to testify? There's a technical legal questions about witnesses. When you're under oath to reveal something, that's a very legal question. If there are two eidim, and there was one took a shvuah not to reveal something, but these questions are debated very, very hotly in terms of an absolute obligation to reveal information versus an obligation that might be allowed in a din Torah. If you withhold testimony, and you're claiming I can't reveal confidences, you might be guilty of lo samor adam reacha. You can cause another person to be executed if you don't reveal certain information. So that's a very serious question. The Rambam has a whole discussion, and not everybody talks about this, about if withholding testimony is part of lo samod, but you have an obligation to testify, how do you justify those two things? And the Achronim go to town on this Rambam's application of these two factors. We'll say lech rochil, lashon hara. These are all very similar, very important averos. You get into a technical discussion of when are you allowed to violate an oath that you took, specifically not to violate confidence. And it depends if there are lives at stake, perhaps, if there are huge monetary issues involved. And that's why you have a bezdin to make a rule. There's no hard and fair, it depends on the case. There's also an interesting question of, is there a category called lashon hara l'to'elis, where you're allowed to say lashon hara if there is a legitimate reason to say so? That's also a fascinating discussion. It might be permissible, even though it's not to protect somebody from physical harm or financial loss, But in the majority of cases, if there's a question, it usually centers around, physical or financial issues. So,
I'm
but,
not gonna shit up fucking.
oh, so I'm coming.
Lashon Hara is the truth. It's not
Okay,
wrong.
so let's fast forward to 2024. The issue of shidduchim. If somebody asks about somebody, how honest do you have to be? And my answer, Adias Dati, would be brutally honest. You're dealing with lives. And I've seen this firsthand. When I was a young principal, I had a number of young women from Muncie, the Yaakov graduates who taught for me, excellent teachers. And one young girl, 18 years old, from a prominent family, was engaged to be married. And by the second day of Sheva Bracha, she was back home with her mother. Because this guy was not what he was, brought up, was not what people said about him. The guy had serious problems. People knew about the problems, but they didn't want to share the shidduch. And it was a horrible, horrible experience. And I said to her, do not talk to a lawyer. Do not talk to a lawyer. I know somebody who knows some friends who will give this guy the option of whether his wife should be a widow or a divorcee. Do not talk to lawyers. Unfortunately, the family was scared. The guy made tremendous financial demands. After all, ich bin, and it ruined his reputation. And he extorted tremendous amounts of money that the family didn't have. Once you speak to lawyers, that's it. And it cost the family a lot of money that they didn't have. They borrow and mortgage. It's horrible. So in this situation, the Rambam is correct. The Rambam says, "Makin oso ad sheyoma rotza ani." You beat the guy up until he says, "Okay, I'll give divorce willingly." That's the Rambam's halacha. And there are people that, now, unfortunately, there was a group that did this, and they were doing a wonderful job. Unfortunately, business became too good, and they started charging for the service. And that's where they got in trouble with the law. When they started charging for it, well, then, but I'm sure you can still find people who, in any event, when it comes to shidduch questions, you have to be brutally honest, even though it means this guy and this gal, it's not going to work. Yeah.
So, no disrespect to any of the great Rabbanan in all kinds of communities throughout the world. They're obviously learned. They know halachas, all of that. And yet, from what I've read, unfortunately, so many of them are the ones that guide these parents to be shashtil, to not say anything, because it will ruin shidduchim for your other children, or your child who has been sitting and has gone on 18 days or something and nothing has happened. And when I hear things like that, I feel like taking these rabbanim by the shoulders and shaking them and going, you can take your mitzvahs, ben adam la'makom,
Right.
to wherever you want. But what about ben adam la'adam? I mean, I just can't stand that double standard. And they're not, they're doing aveirus by doing that.
You're 100% correct. It's worse than that. It's worse than that because in addition to the fact that they don't care specifically for the individual's own needs, there are ways halachically to arrange a divorce, and many gedolim have found ways. Rabbi Yitzchak Alchan, inspector.
I'm not talking about before they make shit.
Yeah. Well, because shidduchim are it's gotten out of control. it's gotten out of control. And it's, a whole session on the shidduch issue now. But you're 100% correct. You're 100% correct. And unfortunately, the network is a very broad network. And if you live in Lakewood and something like this happens, they'll know about it in Baltimore by tomorrow, or Los Angeles by the next day. It's unfortunate, and sometimes you have to shake these rabbanim. I've often said, and I hope I'm wrong, that if the sister or the daughter of any of these Rosh Yeshiva were in that situation, it might affect how they would behave. I don't know. Certainly in terms of getting a divorce. But the halacha is sometimes very difficult. Very difficult. And I'll just end with one case which has happened a few times. We know that in the Holocaust, many people who were thought to have been gassed somehow survived. Or people who were murdered and they lay under other corpses. And some people, to save their lives, when the Nazis, Yamach Shimon, lined up all the people and shot them, so some very, very clever people began to fall down an instant before the bullets began flying. And they were laying under a pile of dead people and able to crawl out at night and escape. But what happens is, and what happened in situations where a couple was married, the wife survived, and people saw the husband go into the gas chamber, or they saw him being shot. After the war, she's still a young woman. Everybody knows her husband's dead. So she remarries. And she has children. Fast forward 25 years, walking along the streets of Bnei Brak, all of a sudden, she sees somebody who looks vaguely familiar. Turned out to be her first husband. He survived. Somehow, he survived. What does she do now? She was technically still married to him. She was an Eishes Ish. She married, and the halacha is, and it's a tough halacha. She has to divorce both husbands. And the children are technically mamzerim. And this has, I know of a half a dozen cases where this has happened. And the worst case was that the children, one son of one of these marriages was a very prominent Rosh Yeshiva. A mamzer Rosh Yeshiva. And what he had to do when it became known, he left his prestigious position and he went out to some moshav in the middle of nowhere where nobody knew him. He started a little yeshiva, a little kollel, but nobody knew who he was.
Wally.
But these are tough situations.
Wally.
Yes.
If she divorces both husbands.
Yes.
And they're not Kohanim, can she remarry one of them?
No. No. I want you to, you can't. No, I mean it's a very problematic issue. It's very disruptive. It's very, very difficult. But all of these things, again, this is not directly related to the issue of confidentiality.
What's the status of the children? Are they mamzerim?
Yes, and they can only marry other mamzerim or geirim.
Okay, thank you.
It's a tough case. So again,
Somebody's married, the husband comes back from the Holocaust.
Yeah,
They have to
divorce both of them. Yeah, it happened a number of times in Israel. Very, very tragic. But all this, as difficult as that might be, it also makes you think about when you tell stories about people that you shouldn't tell, especially when they're true. I mean, the real Lashon Hara, the real revealing of confidences are not lies, they're truth about people. And sometimes truth can be very, very hurtful and harmful. So the best thing is don't engage in idle gossip. And if somebody tells you something, keep it to yourself. The less time we spend schmoozing, the better off we are. Have a wonderful day. Any questions? Okay, great.
Unfortunately, Malawi. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a mazuman?
Gosh Shalema.
Thank you. Have a sign of our Yishun Rochmet Tav Gadollah, B'shus, B'sidim Khan, B'rek Shechal Mishalom, B'rek Shechal Mishalom, Tuva Chayidu, Uno Silecha B'cha B'sa, Kilam B'sta Utuva, Kami Lach, U'meitiv Lachu, B'chim B'schokim B'Hashem Bara, B'rech Ato Adonai Azar Esakol, Baruch atah Adonai al haaretz v'al hamazon. V'nei Yerushalayim v'rakodesh meira v'yameinu Baruch atah Adonai v'nei v'racham ba v'Yerushalayim. Shmuel tov v'mikol tov v'olam ha'yichasreinu. All right. Yeah. All right.
She got divorced, and thank God he signed the prenup, whatever. He's Bukharian. What a dog! I'm telling you, a real dog. And he beat the crap out of her. She was not there very long. Anyway, we hired an attorney, my brother's friend in Brooklyn, and he went after him with everything he had, and he just wouldn't. He avoided him every time they tried to serve him with something. So he went, and he called him up, and he said, "Let me tell you what I'm going to do tomorrow." He says, "We have tried to serve you many times. It's expensive every time you try to." He says, "I am coming to your place of business tomorrow, and I'm standing in the lobby, and I am going to announce, blah, 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 is not holding up to his get. He is not, he signed the get. He's not doing the, and he says, you wouldn't do that." He says, "Really?" He says, "Let me tell you what my email is. Sue my husband at yahoo.com. He says, I'm coming after you with everything I have." He took the papers. It's unbelievable. But I said, "Tim, it's a great email."
In Montreal, when I didn't want to give a get, they followed him to the mikveh. They took his clothes.
Well, my uncle took it from David Stavsky, his niece. She came to New York. It was like coming to the Golden Medina. They introduced her to this Shmendrik. She got married, and the day after the wedding, he says, "I'm not working anymore. I have enough money for your father." So my uncle said to her, "Do not go to the mikveh." He says, "We're coming to New York." And he came with a bunch of his friends. And he said to him, "You have a choice. She could either be a divorcee, or she could be a widow. You pick. Here's your choice."
And that's
He
that's
signed
what
it.
that's what you have to do.
But it's like, who does? I don't know.
Yeah, it's a very
What a bunch of
situation.
crazy people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's why it's very, very
This whole
important.
thing that they keep taking the ads out in the Lincoln in the Jewish
Yeah.
press. What is with this dude? Are you just crazy?
They should leave him in a dark corner one night.
Hang him up by his
That's it,
thumbs.
that's it.
I mean, what does he think?
It's
By
very
not
simple.
giving it, what does he think is a positive thing that is going to come out of this? Seriously.
Twisted minds.
Yeah, yep. The Bergen line is suspended. The Bergen line is suspended. Something happened in Ridgewood, whole switching problem. What? No, they said there's something with the switching problem in Ridgewood, the whole system is on, whatever. Let's get out of here. Let's do what we have to do before I collapse.
You know, it's so beautiful that they honored Rabbi, but the US.
It is very beautiful.
What an incredible criticism. They said how he was the optimum of true Torah.
It was very wonderful. Man, do we have to shut this off?
It could end. You know, I didn't